Welcome to Silicon Valley Buzz, a show that discusses the happenings in the most exciting spot on the planet for new ideas. And I'm your host, Seth Shostak. Tonight, a topic that's roiling Cupertino development. Now, is it improving that city or turning it into something that the citizenry neither wanted nor ordered? And after all, what happens in Cupertino could happen anywhere in the South Bay. So joining me tonight to discuss the implications of what's going on just next door is Richard Bernhardt. Richard is a former Sunnyvale Planning Commissioner, a lawyer, Cupertino resident, and the owner of Bernhardt Communications Company, right? Did I get that right?
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, welcome to Silicon Valley Buzz, Richard.
Thank you. Glad
all right.
to be here.
Cupertino, the city of Cupertino, one of the best educated collection of citizens anywhere, and the home of fabled Apple computer. Everybody knows that. But it's roiling, it's boiling. And what's turned up the heat seems to be something that happens all the time throughout the country, the redevelopment of a faded shopping mall. Valco, in this case. What's going on here? So
it's one of a string of developments, actually, that are coming into Cupertino, and Cupertino is sort of re-emerging out of the recession from 2008. For a long period of time, there was nothing going on in Cupertino, as with most of the South Bay cities, and now development running like crazy. And the Valco Village is a very long and established shopping center that's pretty much abandoned at this point. There's some movie theaters and shops left there, but very few. And they want to develop a very, very, very large center there.
Well, I mean, that doesn't sound amiss, right? You say it's kind of a faded shopping center, largely abandoned. So they're going to build something they call the Hills.
Right.
Good reason for the name?
They want to build a hill. The thought is that they're going to have a very large park-like environment on the roof, about 50,000 square feet, if I believe correctly. That's part of the development, is to have that on it.
50,000 square feet.
Mm-hmm.
So okay, so that's like 700 feet on a side. I mean, that's a pretty big hunk of real estate. It kind of, in the artist renditions of this thing, which anybody can find on the web, of course, sure. It looks like, you know, sort of Central Park in Cupertino.
Mm-hmm. So the artist renditions are beautiful, and in fact, that's what was appealing and probably is appealing to most people, is that they're aware that this shopping center is not being used as it used to be, and they want something central to Cupertino to be wonderful and large. Problem is that it seems to be the trend in Cupertino, that a town that used to be 40,000 people is now 60,000 people, with well over 100,000 people during the day, has approved about 5 or 6 major developments. The Valco is one of the ones in contention. And the most well-known one, and the one that Mr. Jobs put into place, is Apple II, or the spaceship as it's called, bringing in another 11 to 12,000 employees.
Yeah, the giant donut, if you will.
Right.
It's like a mile in circumference or something. If you need to go visit somebody else's office, maybe you have to book a flight. I don't know. All right, 10, 11, 12, 13,000 people in that, in a city which only has 4 times that population total residing there. Okay, but so redeveloping Valco into the Hills, I mean, there's going to be housing in that, right? I mean, it isn't just, you know, what is it? It's residential, but it's also office space and presumably commercial space?
And retail as well. It's the purpose of that site, as most developers see it, and as the city saw it in the general plan, was for something called mixed use, which is all of the things you mentioned, a combination of residential and retail and office spaces. What's being contended at that particular space is the amount of each of those things and how big it will be and what it will look like when it's finished. A lot of developments in the Bay Area, they start off on paper as one thing, and they become something very, very different by the time they're done.
Okay, so there are 2 possible points of contention here. First, what's really going to happen with this development. I mean, the plans certainly look impressive, and nobody's going to miss the old Valco, so maybe the Hills is a good thing to do, unless it goes outside the line, so to speak, in case it doesn't pass the smell test when they move a little farther. Now, that's one thing. And the other thing is, you know, well, to what extent would this thing benefit, or, if you will, actually be a negative for the residents of Cupertino? You know, if I live a mile away from this thing, but still in Cupertino, would I care about this? So let's begin with that first point.
Sure.
Who's behind this development? I mean, is it local?
Sand Hill Development, and they are a major developer. They've developed things in Palo Alto and Mountain View, and sort of developed things in Sunnyvale. If you look at the Sunnyvale Town Center, what used to be the Sunnyvale Town Center, they were going to develop the mall that was going to replace the Sunnyvale Town Center. And it's been not entirely to Sandhill's fault, but there's been a stall in that project for nearly a decade. If you go to downtown Sunnyvale today, you see girders, and that's it. A couple of the Target on one side, and I think Macy's on the other, and that's pretty much it, where a shopping center used to be. They went through a couple of bankruptcies, a couple of issues with the city, and that is one of the issues that is before the electorate right now is will Sandhill come through and do this beautiful, glorious thing that they're showing on paper, or will they start out by enticing people and showing them the beautiful, glorious thing and come up with something totally different?
So what's the control on that? I mean, presumably the city will evaluate their proposal and either vote yay or nay on it. I mean, they have to get approval from the city, and the city presumably looks at this in terms of its general plan. Every city has a general plan. Not Cupertino? Well,
Cupertino does have a general plan. In fact, that general plan was only very recently, within the past year, adopted by the city. They went through a major look at where they want things to be and what's the tenor and tone that they want in Cupertino. A general plan's purpose in any city across the United States is to be a blueprint for what should be in our city. What does the citizens feel the look and feel should be? What do they feel it should be in terms of density? What's the character of it? What's the land use? And very importantly, how does it affect infrastructure? And that is one of the hot points in Cupertino, is the fact that when Apple came through to put in the spaceship, or Apple II's new campus, they were guaranteed and given some concessions on things that they needed to do to keep Apple in Cupertino. Apple has its headquarters in Cupertino, and the city, and I would say most of the citizens, really wanted to keep that employment in the city. And so a lot of concessions were made, and now I think developers believe that they should have the same concessions wherever they do a development. And Valco, or the Hills, the new development, is just down the street, really, from where that is. And the contention is that the city is granting general plan changes in a fashion that's not consistent with what should be for the city.
In other words, they're willing to sort of not worry too much about whether this fits in with the general plan, simply because they're thinking of the economic benefits, or is there sort of inside baseball here? What's going on? I mean, are they legally allowed to deviate from the general plan?
Well, I'm an attorney, but I'm not speaking on behalf of the law in this matter. But I will say that they're being very they're sitting on a bit of a ledge. And why I say that is that
they being
the city council.
Right.
If the city council is zoning for a particular development or developer, then they can get themselves in some issues, because that's not what planning is about. Planning is not about, I want it for this guy or for this company or for this thing. And to be honest, I think when Steve Jobs came in front of the Cupertino City Council and pled his case for the spaceship, there was a little bit of that, and probably accepting so. It was right in the face of the recession, a lot of jobs, a lot of prestige in Apple. But the question is, should that carry forth to every development in the city of Cupertino, and what's happening with that?
Well, I mean, you say every development, and there have been some others. I wrote a few down here, the Apple Donut, of course, right, the UFO, whatever. But also the Oaks, a sure, 9-story hotel on the site of an old Goodyear operation, the Marina Supermarket site. I mean, but this sort of stuff goes on all the time, even if Cupertino hasn't seen this kind of redevelopment. So the question is, what's really the objection to what they're planning for the Hills, other than the fact that, well, they tried to redevelop downtown Sunnyvale, and that hasn't been a success story? Is it simply worry about whether they'll complete the project, or is the worry that they've unduly influenced the city council and are getting concessions that they otherwise shouldn't get?
Well, I think it's a combination of things, and it's really important to understand what a general plan does. As I said, it's the blueprint of what you want your city to be. And to some degree, it's a generalized document. It's not meant to be the specific zoning for a particular place. That's what zoning rules are about. And the question is, when you live in the South Bay, are you just concerned with what happens within the confines of your city, these legal boundaries, or are you concerned with what's happening in Sunnyvale and Saratoga and Palo Alto and Mountain View and San Jose? they do have an effect. And when all of the cities are doing major development at this point, the question is, what is the reasoning that they're accepting? Are they accepting it because it's a good value for their citizens and good planning, or are they doing so because it's very enticing to do so at this point?
And what about competition among the cities? I mean,
sure.
if the city next to you is doing all this development, you sort of hate to see that escape your city, right? I mean,
I appeared in front of the City Council about a month ago to talk about those exact, 4 of those exact developments, because they were, 3 of them were asking for general plan amendments. And one of the questions was, do we build a 10-story hotel in this city? Is it appropriate to build it on De Anza Boulevard right next to another hotel in a shopping center? Is it appropriate to build things that are much denser than we're used to in like the Oaks at the end of Highway 85 near De Anza College? They want to put large office buildings there. And one of the issues is the type and character of what's going to go into that development. Is it going to be office space, residential, and retail? One of the big issues is that the number and amount of office space seems to be growing and growing and growing. And that can clog up your roads, it can eat your infrastructure. Big issue.
Are you talking about the hills specifically, or just in general?
No, it's not just the hills.
Okay.
You have a certain intensity that a city can withstand without taking mitigating measures in order to solve for those things.
Most people go to work every morning. They don't think about this stuff. They may read about it in the local papers. More likely, they don't read about it in the local papers. But at least in this case, in Cupertino, there's been a citizens' initiative to challenge deviations from the general plan. And I think the initiative is called the Cupertino Citizens Sensible Growth Initiative. Is the hills what sparked this?
Well, it's part of it, sure. The initiative was brought about because I think there was a sort of a discontent in the city about constantly changing something that had just been put into place. The general plan is about a year old, and they're going through cycles of making amendments to the general plan, and I think citizens got frustrated with the fact that they're doing it here, and they're doing it here, and they're doing it here, and not playing into what was the reason for doing the general plan in the first place. I want to take a little issue with you, though. You said people don't think about this on a daily basis. I think they really do. When you get on Highway 280 and you come to a halt, or you get on Prune Ridge and you come to a halt, or you get on Wolf and you come to a halt, you do think about these things. You just don't think of them in terms of planning.
But do they make that connection? They come to a halt, and maybe what they're thinking is, why don't we build more highways? Maybe they're not thinking about, oh, that redeveloped shopping center down the street.
So when I was a kid, I would ride my bike to school. Now every parent takes their kid to school. And if you've been to a Cupertino school lately, you can see that cars will back up for miles. McClellan is a really good example where there's 3 schools, not including De Anza, all in a row. The problem is the roads are only so wide, and unless you're going to use them in a domain and start adopting houses, there's nowhere to go. You can't make them bigger. So where does all this traffic go?
Okay.
The hills is a great example because you're going to put in between 1.8 and 2 million square feet of additional development right in front of a 2 million square foot development that Apple is putting in. And in between those, you're going to put in the Hamptons.
Yeah. Okay. Well, they're moving from New York. Okay. What's been the City Council's reaction to this initiative? I mean, this doesn't happen terribly often, that you get, the citizens coming out with lanterns and pitchforks saying, we don't want these developers doing this.
I think they're a little bit nervous, to be honest with you. Maybe they should be. For the first time, they got both things that they wanted. They got a lot of interest from developers to do things in their city, and they also got a lot of citizens interested in what they're doing. And so we've got now the battle of the initiatives. So we've got an initiative, the Cupertino Sensible Growth Initiative that you talked about, which seeks to place some restriction on general plan amendments, placing major general plan amendments in front of the electorate, saying if you're going to do this, we have to vote in favor of it. And then 3 of the recent developments were turned down because they didn't accept the general plan, and so now those developers have seen an avenue to get to what they want. So they're also looking at doing initiatives to get past the City Council to build their developments.
What about the mayor, Barry Chang?
He's a lively guy, and he's raised some ire because he's not afraid to speak his mind, we'll say that. And in a city council meeting recently, he called somebody a liar to their face. He's not a timid guy.
Yeah, no, and he's not free of criticism in the press either.
True.
I mean, well, all right. Is there something special going on here in Cupertino? I mean, really, as a citizen, if I were part of that initiative, it might be because I suspect that there's something going on behind the scenes, something tying developers to the city council that, you know, doesn't smell so good. Or is that just conspiracy theory nonsense?
Well, I can't speak for the city council, but I have attended a number of the city council meetings, and you know, I don't think people go into the business of city council for the profit of it all. It's not a profitable business. It's something that you do because you have a love for doing that. Having sat on a planning commission for 5.5 years, till 2 o'clock in the mornings every other week, listening to people speak, you do that because you want to, not because of the benefits of it. Now, is there some influence going on there? I couldn't tell you, but what I will tell you is that people perceive that. Yeah. And in perceiving that, it's having an effect, and it's waking up an electorate that's sort of been asleep. And maybe that's a good thing, I don't know. Do you think there's any chance that the Hills would be derailed at this point? Well, it's possible. It's not that they would be totally derailed. What the Sensible Initiative, the Cupertino Sensible Initiative calls for is keeping it as a retail type mall. It can be mixed use, but I think a lot of the use that Sandhill has intended in business park type of use would not be allowed, and that could be derailed. There are allocations on the amount in the general plan and by the county on the amount of office space that's allowed to be added into a region each period of time, each year. And that would bring that to quite a bit larger than what those limits are. All right, Richard, let's step back from the messy politics for a moment and consider the bigger picture, and that is the effect on the citizenry of this kind of thing. If I happen to live, as I say, maybe a mile away from this thing, how would I be discomfited by this? I mean, really, it will add some housing, and that might be attractive for people working for Apple, or maybe just seniors who need a place to live. Yeah, there's nothing inherently negative about building housing. The issue is whether or not you have the capacity to build all of these things and still have a functional city. Not only a functional city, but a city in the character and fashion that you want it to be. And I speak as a 25-plus year resident of Cupertino, so I'm not just speaking as somebody looking at the planning side of this. Water, power, sewage, traffic, schools, all impacted by major developments like this. If you have trouble taking your kids to school now, you're going to have more trouble taking your kids to school. If you are told by the San Jose Water District that you should cut back on the use of your water, imagine the amount of water that 18,000 new employees are going to be using. This does have an effect. It's not all negative. I mean, you mentioned the fact that if you put housing close to places where people work, that can have a positive effect. Question is, what kind of housing, and whether or not the people who are living in that housing will actually reside next to where they work, as in near Apple or one of the major employers in the town, or whether or not it's just another set of housing that people are going to commute to. And if that's the case, then you're going to have traffic problems for sure. Now, I can imagine that for some of these infrastructure requirements, for example, additional police or fire and so forth, well, if they're generating more income because there's some businesses there, then maybe you can just hire that. But things like water and, of course, traffic. I mean, I don't know what the traffic is like in downtown Cupertino, but I certainly know what it's like on Highway 85, and it's a lot of sheet metal not moving very quickly. And so, you know, as you pointed out, that might actually be a real point. One difference between Cupertino and Mountain View is that we have, you know, of course we have buses, they have buses there, but we have express buses down El Camino Real, but we also have light rail and we have heavy rail. And Cupertino doesn't have any of the latter two there, right? Right. There is bus service. The VTA does operate within Cupertino. There is no light rail. One thing to the positive of the City Council in Cupertino is that they are working very hard to try and work with the VTA and other transit authorities to try and do mitigation to traffic concerns. I want to come back to something you said a moment ago. Oh, we can just hire some people to take care of that. Can we? And that really presents something. When you're going to build a very large retail establishment and office complex, which depends upon low to medium wage personnel, and the average cost of the housing there is going to stay at Bay Area, South Bay costs, and the cost of all of the things associated with being there is going up and up and up. I'm not so sure you can hire the people to do that, and that's an issue right now. Well, that sounds like, and some people say there's a lack of retail in Cupertino as well, and of course, you know, it's gone away at Valco, but it doesn't sound like it's adding much unless I misconstrue the kind of development that's going on. Well, there's a development right across the street from Valco, Main Street, I believe it's called, that just went in. And that's a really good example of why I have a concern as a citizen, and a number of the people who I think are working with the initiative have a concern, that the pretty picture that you're seeing up front by Sandhill is going to be the end result of what you get. And what happened at that development was a lot of the things that showed up in those pretty pictures are no longer there. And
well, give me an example on.
So I believe there was supposed to be a senior housing there. There was supposed to be a gymnasium there. There was supposed to be substantially more retail in that area. They went with a much larger allotment of office space. They got rid of the gym. They got rid of the senior housing. There were changes made. Some of them probably because it made more economic sense, some of them because it may just not have fit as well as the planning was in the first place. I don't know the reasoning why they made the changes.
There seems to be a leitmotif that they sell you on one idea, one distribution of the various components of this development, and then they increase the office space.
Well, they can't just do that of their own volition. They have to come through the planning process to do it. And this is one of the concerns that these initiatives, the people behind the initiative have brought, is that, okay, if you bring something before the city council and you show the citizenry this is what you're going to build, there should be some accountability that ultimately that is what's going to be built. And there's two avenues for that. One is that we develop something that we didn't expect and then have a problem with that because it's not what we planned for. The other is that it doesn't really get built, that some component of it or all of it, as in Sunnyvale, doesn't get built either for economic reasons, for the developer can't afford it, or whatever reason that it doesn't get built. If it doesn't get built, then you have a very, very central location in Cupertino, the retail center like Valco, that's just not getting used.
And who gets holding the bag if they halfway build it and then quit and they just walk away?
Well, I think everyone gets holding the bag there. I mean, in the sense that what happened in Sunnyvale was the developers lost, the bank lost, certainly the chamber and the business community lost, and the citizenry doesn't have a downtown Sunnyvale mall that they wanted to have. I don't know anyone who really won in that situation. You got blight right now. That's what you have in Sunnyvale.
Another point, the height of buildings. This particular project has raised the specter of buildings that are no longer, if you will, kind of human size. I don't know what the height limit in Cupertino is now. It's 30, 35 feet, something like that, right? And they want to raise it to 45 feet for the hills.
Well, yeah, I believe that development wants to do, it's 46, I think, is the maximum height that's being proposed. And I speak only from what I've heard on this subject. I don't know all the legal side of it. But one of the concerns about the initiative was and is, does this mean we're raising the height limits for the whole city, including the residential district? Can I build a 3-story or close to a 4-story building in my neighborhood where there's 1-story buildings because now the height limit is higher? There was some conversation about whether or not this meant that there was a universal height limit, and I believe the city spent quite a bit of money to try and figure this out, and there's some controversy around this at this point. There's some controversy about which reports were accurate and which reports weren't, and the city is going to struggle with that a little bit. Because height limits can make a big difference in the character of a city. Well,
I lived in a small town, well, it wasn't so small, a couple of 100,000 people, a lot larger than Cupertino, actually, in Europe. And there were essentially no buildings more than 3 or 4 stories. Almost all, there were a couple of towers, buildings going back to the 12th century, but all the buildings you saw throughout the city were limited to maybe 3 or 4 stories. And that made it very friendly to people. It was people size. Right. You weren't walking through canyons. So that really makes a difference. So it is important for me to know how seriously they take these height limits, for the city in general.
So having been a developer and been a planning commissioner and being a citizen, I've kind of seen it from all angles. And what you're talking about is scale and dimension. So if I'm a certain height and I reflect a building of a certain height, there's a pedestrian feel to that building or there's an urban feel to that establishment. And, Cupertino's sort of been among behemoth cities around the Bay Area. It's still always had the character of a small or medium-sized city. It's not San Jose, and that's always the conflict is are we getting more like San Jose? Are we developing more like Los Angeles? Are we becoming more like San Francisco or Oakland? We're a fairly small city. Cupertino is a fairly small city. So the scale of the buildings need to match the character in the general plan, and that's why I keep coming back to the general plan. That's the document, as it were, that sort of codifies what that scale should be. And if you start altering it on a regular basis, why are you doing that? You know, if the citizens have agreed, this is the scale, we want a pedestrian scale, we want a smaller size feel, and then you have a 5-story building or a 6-story or even bigger, what happens?
Yeah, well, what does happen? I mean, you just kick out the city council at the next election, but maybe it's too late at that point.
Yeah, see, the thing is that developments and the whole process of development is a long process. Entitlements, the ability to get the permits, to do the environmental reports, to get things through, to get them, the ground set up, to do the developments, to do the leasing is a very long process. And very often it runs over more than one city council. And so what was happening 3 or 4 years ago is sort of what's happening now in the actual building stage. So yes, it's not an immediate response.
All right, Richard, we've been talking a lot about one redevelopment project here, but this is, after all, the Hills might be viewed as a canary in the coal mine for the bigger picture of the South Bay, which was once an idyllic agricultural area. Yeah. Today, well, it's still one of the most desirable places on the planet to live. I can't contest that. But there are fears that sort of piece by piece, kind of a salami tactic here, we may turn it into an endless urban maze. I drive down El Camino and there are more apartments going up, and they're 5, 6 stories high, and I'm going to be in a canyon soon enough. New York, but with better weather maybe. Mm-hmm. Should we be worried about this? I mean, what's the end game here? How long can we do this?
Well, I have been here since the 60s. And every year that same question gets raised because it's not the first time in the South Bay that we've seen development. We go through phases. Every 7 years they say the tenor on the style of thing that runs through the Bay Area is another big thing, whether it was the internet or defense or all kinds of different things that have run through here. So it is a very desirable place to be. And I think if we overbuild it so much, that character may be lessened. I don't think we're going to see gloom and doom.
All right. Well, Richard Bernhardt, thank you so very much for being my guest tonight.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Seth Shostak. This is Silicon Valley Buzz. I want to thank our director, Bobby Chastain, and especially our hard-working series producer, Susan Hubbard, and invite you back to next month's episode of Silicon Valley Buzz. Good evening to you.